one of the learnings from Jake, that I feel really strongly is that there is the place for an entire spectrum of relationships that we are cultivating.
People in general give more when they see stories. I mean, we've seen this in our data over the past 8 years.
There's an escapism that comes from the internet in many ways. And I think that's what this humor and this levity that you're talking about can lend itself to these nonprofits.
We can't ignore the donors of tomorrow, and I think that's kind of one of the important lessons from Jake.
Like, how do you cut through the noise? How do you separate yourself and stand out?
All of these nonprofits are building community, and within your community, oftentimes there are individuals who have some form of presence.
Welcome to another episode of Shoestrings, the podcast for nonprofit marketers and challenger brands who know how to turn scraps into impact. Every episode, we're going to reverse engineer an award-winning campaign and ask the big question: what is the shoestring version of this idea? And as always, you're going to hear three distinct perspectives at the table: the CEO, the creative director, and the marketer. So you'll get the full picture from strategy all the way through to execution. Today, it's Greg's turn in the hot seat. Greg, what do you bring to the table today?
Thanks, Ben. I'm bringing one that I'm really excited about. And when we started talking about this idea and this concept for a podcast, this was one of the first things that came to mind, not just because it's a compelling campaign, though certainly it's one that I think we're all kind of aware of and have seen in many different forms, but it has such a long life to it and all of the different forms it's taken that I feel like I'm really invested in this character, and I think a lot of people are, whether they're conscious of it or not. So who I'm talking about is Jake from State Farm, our favorite khaki wearing insurance salesman, who I feel like has been in the public consciousness for well over a decade now. So really and I just want to kind of go back and do a little bit of history of Jake from State Farm, just so we're all on the same wavelength with, who we're talking about and kind of the different forms it's taken. And then I feel like it's such a great example for nonprofits in terms of how to think of their brand and really how brands are kind of taking on this new form in 2025, and the cues they can take from that, and maybe ways that they can look internally to find similar characters who can be spokespeople for their mission. So I don't know if you guys remember, but way back in 2010, 2011 was the first time that Jake from State Farm emerged on television. And there was this really popular commercial at the time. It was called State of Unrest, where it was a husband downstairs in the middle of the night at 3:00 in the morning. And he was making these really discreet phone calls.
Yeah, I'm married. Doesn't matter. You do that for me? Really? Yeah, I'd like that.
Who are you talking to?
It's Jake from State Farm.
And then he keeps talking, and it's in these really, kind of overt tones, where it could be misinterpreted as being talking to a mistress or something like that. And she says, Jake from State Farm, sure. And she takes the phone from him.
What are you wearing, Jake from State Farm?
Khakis? Hey, do they ever ask you what you're wearing?
Yeah.
And that khakis, I feel was one of the viral moments of the year, and something that people continuously invoked in those water cooler conversations. But anyway, so that commercial aired for years and years, and I feel most people will remember seeing it. And then they re-emerged it in, I think it was like 2020, 2021, during a Super Bowl spot where they sort of handed off the baton. So the original Jake from State Farm was actually a real employee in that commercial. And they brought on a new person to kind of take on that mantle. And it was an actor. His name's Kevin Miles. And there was basically like recreation of that same spot. But the new actor was the one to kind of field the call. And then Jake, the original Jake from State Farm, made a cameo where they're both in the office together in their cubicles. And Kevin, the new actor, asks, do people often ask what you're wearing? And Jake sort of like peers from behind the cubicle and says, yeah, happens all the time. So anyway, this is like become like a new thing where, that was sort of the jumping off point. But now Jake from State Farm has become really like the brand ambassador for State Farm Insurance in a way that, we associate maybe like the gecko, from Geico, in different kind of examples like that, where he is really like the face of the company, especially on social. And it sort of evolved into not just like a spokesperson, but by kind of embodying this like creator type perspective, especially on like platforms like TikTok, he is able to collaborate with different creators, with different celebrities. He's able to like embody a lot of TikTok trends, and he's able to speak to this Gen Z audience in a way that is completely unprecedented for an insurance company, right? We talk to brands, and you guys know like all the time, who might be a little bit on the fence about like whether or not like their mission is like lends itself to that type of like entertainment, And if you think about it, it's like they're literally embodying an insurance salesman, which might be, the most kind of like mundane of all mundane like professions that you can conjure. And they're making it into one of the most entertaining kind of viral personalities on the internet. And so, I feel like it's such a great template for, with a little bit of creativity, there is nothing, you can't exhaust, from your brand. And there's, kind of like these untapped personalities, within our own organizations, potentially that can kind of take on a similar role. But before we get into it, I've got some questions for you guys. I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the reach metrics of this approach just in recent years, because it's really, really staggering. So almost 100 million people reached, 200 plus million video views, 160,000 days of watch time. State Farm, as of a little bit earlier this year, I'm not sure what the current number is, they had over 1 million TikTok followers. But what I think is the really cool metric here, over half of them are Gen Z. Now, insurance is not something that you can purchase in like the TikTok shop, right? So why are they doing that? Well, they're cultivating the next generation. They're kind of cultivating this aspirational audience, which is also something I want to talk about, because I feel like not enough organizations are thinking about what is our plan for the next 10, 15, 20 years. They're thinking about kind of the immediate conversion. Who are our donors of today? But State Farm is really investing in, okay, if we're going to delight a 15-year-old at home by participating in a TikTok trend or having this viral presence, how is that person they're going to think of State Farm when they pick up their phone and need insurance, or, buy a home or wherever they're at kind of in their life because of this character, which I think is so, so cool. So yeah, that's kind of the history of Jake from State Farm in a nutshell. But I'm curious, like when you guys think of Jake and kind of what he's meant to that company, how would you kind of use that as a template, or what do you think is like the most important learning for a nonprofit organization from this success? Just curious.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really particularly interesting and cool about it is the humanization of something that's complex, right? So insurance, I don't think that anyone thinks about insurance in a favorable or good, positive way. But when you put a real person behind it, which is exactly what they started with, right? The original Jake from Jake Farm being an actual employee, it becomes much more personal and real and genuine. And then as you perpetuate that and make them part of culture and allow them to do, I mean, like the Fortnite dance or whatever, and then integrate them into what is our current culture and reality, it humanizes things that can be very complex. And I think within our field, and particularly with nonprofits, sometimes we're talking about things that are incredibly complex. And to have someone that is relatable, constantly there, and comforting to some degree makes it easier to digest things that are much more complex. I don't know if you have some additions to that, but I think that that's like the first and foremost of this concept. It's a humanization of of something that typically is just overbearing, complex, and not really inviting, which allows us to do the exact opposite. It makes it incredibly approachable, which I think is why it's successful.
Totally. I think, most nonprofits, as we know, because we've worked with a lot of them throughout our career so far, they speak in kind of like an institutional voice. Everything that a nonprofit says typically errs on the safe side. It's often distant. It's often forgettable. I think what Jake did so well is that, yeah, he represented the brand in a way audiences could emotionally attach to, not just like hear from. So yeah, it's a fun kind of thing for a nonprofit to think about, because I think the mission statement is often like the big central DNA of a nonprofit. But when you start thinking beyond the mission statement to something a lot more human and emotional that can anchor everything, having a character like Jake makes total sense. Like how do you use a character in your organization to shape the values? Who is the living symbol of a nonprofit? And if you look at the millions of nonprofits out there, there's actually almost none of them that have a character. And I think, a big question, I think, hopefully in this podcast is why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can kind of take it a few different approaches. Like I feel like in my experience having worked for nonprofits too, I think there can be a lot of insecurity when it comes to putting yourself in front of a camera, right? That just is natural. And even if you're a nonprofit that has like an internal social team, right? And you want to interview someone, even if it's just for like a talking head, interview, then like, the style, that is more traditional. I feel like those people can still, there still is like a tendency for people to feel insecure, to be on guard. Sometimes like the first reaction to something like that is like, oh, I'll do it, but it's like a little bit reluctant. And so to even take it one step further and to become a character, like a Jake, that seems like such a leap that I feel like most people would kind of like hear that suggestion and be like, I don't know. I don't feel like the right personality is here. Or would we have to hire, someone who is super Gen Z to almost become the Jake for us as if they were like an actor playing a role? And I feel like there's some recent examples that are really compelling where using like an internet trend, you can almost like take a little bit of the discomfort out of the equation. So one of the things I saw a lot last year was there were a couple of like museums that took their curators. And curators in like the museum world are known for being, highly intellectualized people. A lot of them have PhDs. Certainly, like the last people, who might be on the pulse of, the latest TikTok trends. And they started doing these funny videos where they would put their curators like in front of, an object like at the museum or maybe a famous work of art. and they would script what they would say about the art and use like super contemporary language to talk about it, like, you know, how this painting slaps, you know, or, you know, this is fire, whatever, you know, whatever it was. And there was something about like the contrast between the kind of intellectual demeanor and then inserting like that kind of language that made for just like a really delightful contrast. And so I feel like that is like a great learning, I think, for a lot of organizations, which is, you know, to inject a little bit of levity, especially if your mission is something that is super serious, like in the way that, you know, a lot of the nonprofits that we work with, you know, I wouldn't, you know, describe in some cases, you know, these are sort of life, you know, kind of life-changing things that people are experiencing, or, you know, the interventions that they are creating, you know, are really like important for people. So, you know, maybe what is kind of like the levity and where is that acceptable? So that's what I would think, you know, is like a great place to start, which is like, you know, thinking of it as an opportunity to almost like let your hair down a little bit and talk to somebody like a human. And I feel like levity is such a great way of doing that. I think it makes intimidating subjects, like you were saying, Daniel, you know, just kind of like insurance, like in general, feel very accessible to people in a way that it wouldn't, you know, if the approach was like super serious. Here are the terms and conditions, you know, here are your rates, you know. State Farm isn't interested in any of that. That's not what's in their TikTok content, you know.
I think, you know, you're hitting on another point that just in general is part of the zeitgeist of internet culture, which is we live in this world that has so much access, so much media, and so much political and other BS that has created this sense of distress. I would say, and as a result, there's an escapism that comes from the internet in many ways, and I think that's what this humor and this levity that you're talking about can lend itself to these nonprofits and generally any company in a wonderful way, because we need some of that escapism, especially when we're talking about things that are difficult or hard or problematic. And I think a lot of the times in the nonprofit space, that is the stuff that you're talking about, is things that are, you know, difficult for a specific community, or, you know, we're trying to create change. So approaching it with levity from a personalized and humanized perspective all of a sudden breaks down a bunch of walls that frankly you're fighting every single day because you're talking about something that's difficult. So for me, I think that's one of the other things that could be a major lesson is understanding the zeitgeist, understanding that we need escapism, and when you're talking about things that are a little bit difficult, coming from a perspective of humor and human interest, all of a sudden you get to, I think your example of the curators, you know, calling you know, the Mona Lisa lit or fire is hilarious. You know, it's not what's expected, and all of a sudden you break down that wall that is otherwise there.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk about fundraising for a second, just because it's such a huge part of what nonprofits do. You know, when you think about how many nonprofits there are in the US, I believe there's about 1.8 million nonprofits in the US alone. They're all competing for attention, for trust, and for your dollars. You then factor in the world we live in, where there's GoFundMe campaigns going for, you know, peer-to-peer. There's peer-to-peer fundraising. You know, so there's now more things competing for donor attention than there's ever been in history. I think it's such an interesting thought. Like, how do you cut through the noise? How do you separate yourself and stand out? And kind of like, also, I would encourage nonprofits to put themselves inside the head of the donor. Like, what is it that a donor is looking for? Because I think, you know, Greg, most donors typically give more emotionally than maybe rationally. People in general give more when they see stories. I mean, we've seen this in our data over the past 8 years with our clients, that, you know, people are giving based on storytelling, not necessarily a mission statement. They're connecting to faces as opposed to just core values within a company. So I think a donor's first impression, whether it's on Instagram, on an email, a newsletter, word of mouth, is often the only chance that you get. So like, how do you make that impression stick?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think allowing for room, I feel like so many nonprofits are time strapped, they're resource strapped, of course, that I think when they think of, it's certainly like a lot of our partners, like when they think of content in general, I think they always think of it as speaking to that person who is ready to give and in the moment kind of ready to either give or support. And that is sort of like the priority. And I think one of the learnings from Jake, that I feel really strongly is that there is the place for an entire spectrum of relationships that we are cultivating. And one is not necessarily more important to the other. Maybe one is more important in the short term because somebody is able to take out their wallet and to donate in Giving Tuesday or year-end giving or whatever the case might be, but we can't ignore the donors of tomorrow. And I think that's kind of one of the important lessons from Jake, and I think it's something that State Farm is really thinking about. So I do think that there's room for both, where maybe like the latest TikTok trend isn't going to be the converting content, right? But does that make it any less important, or does that mean that there's not room for it at all? Does it seem, I think, to a lot of people like just kind of this silly thing that you do to do, but there's no real kind of like metric associated with it that is meaningful in any way? And I would say that, one of the other like stats that I had just written down from the campaign, which I thought was so interesting, was there's been just over the past couple of years an over 7% lift in Gen Z brand preference related to State Farm since this campaign kicked off, which, is not like an incremental thing. Like that's like a pretty big shift, right? And I think what they're doing, which is so smart, is instilling like this sort of trust in a way that is saying, okay, like we can be both like your friend. We are a good hang, with you on social, so to speak, but we're also going to be there for you in a more professional capacity whenever you need it. And I feel like both things are worth thinking about. So no, like, do I think that, tapping, a concept like, the latest trend or something like Jake, is going to be the, sort of emotional heartstrings like needed, for someone to, to pull out their wallet and to, commit to, a membership or a donation or whatever the case might be? Maybe not, but I think it's part of a bigger picture that we're often missing because we can only see, 5 feet in front of us. But I think we really need to be expanding that thinking a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to just add, I think from that global perspective, there's this interesting thing that comes into play too, where all of a sudden, when you are speaking to this younger audience, they are still connecting to their parents and people around them. So you are growing that net and that infrastructure. So even if it's not your immediate play, I think you are reaching those donor dollars through an outside perspective. You're not necessarily trying to tap into their email, but through their children or through an alternative source where someone's going to send you a TikTok video, all of a sudden you do get into that phone or that person's inbox in a way where they will potentially donate. So there's, in doing something that is extraneous, you end up where you want to be just by being interesting, different, and willing to be comedic, I think. And I think also, to your point, you are building an audience for your future, which is incredibly important, because if you can only think of today, tomorrow you're not going to get the funding you need. You've lost all the people who are donating and cultivating and generating, which is incredibly important for longevity and sustainability.
Yeah, I'm curious. So, like, Ben, if a client sits down with you and they hear this podcast or just in like a conversation, you're talking about Jake, from State Farm as sort of like an example. Like, if they want to up, their game on TikTok or on social in general, and look for those characters, not a brand in the traditional sense, not like, super high level, the sort of Wizard of Oz, behind the curtain, but a personality that people can connect to. Where are some places that you would urge them to look within the organization? Who are some people, that they might consider? Yeah, just curious, like, how would you advise somebody look for a personality like this underneath their own umbrella?
Just off the top of my head, take an organization that might be in the food donation category, like a Feeding America. Is there a character you can create from a local food bank in, say, like Detroit or Chicago, that becomes the face on Instagram, that checks in every week, gives updates from the food bank, does the email newsletters, does the fundraising campaigns, shows up at donor and fundraising events. So there's a consistent voice across all of the touch points at the nonprofit. I think there's not going to be a one size fits all model. I think you could have, like, some organizations could create like a digital avatar that could become the Jake. Another one, like a Feeding America, could quite literally have someone is on the front line at a food bank in a city. But I think ultimately it's like, how do they show up in culture? How do they show up and in tweets and memes and skits? How could they be a partner for some of their corporate clients? Yeah, I think it's going to vary a lot. But for me, I just see nonprofits in general as erring on the side of caution. Let's not isolate storytelling to a year-end campaign.
All of these nonprofits are building community. And within your community, oftentimes there are individuals who have some form of presence on social and otherwise. And as part of your community, I think you should try to harness their success and use that success to leverage your own messaging and make them a proponent of your story and brand. Obviously, they don't necessarily have to be your Jake from State Farm, but they can become an integral part of how you reach those touch points and enter into other, markets and touch points that haven't been reached before, because they are already part of it. So I do think that's important. But Ben, to your point, always on marketing, I think you need to have, anytime you go and do something, you need to have someone on set, or part of that march or part of that walk or whatever, who is your brand representative. I mean, I think you look at the Gary V's of the world, and the reason that we're so ingrained and willing to participate is because they have made their personality the brand, and vice versa. And I think you need to do that as a brand these days. I mean, I think that we've seen some downfalls of this as well, with the Elon Musks of the world who politicize their branding, but you also have this really incredible upside, which is, if you have someone who can go there and be a part of these things that you're doing, all of a sudden, through their branding and their own personal, representation, you grow your audience. And all of a sudden you have a person that is a representation of the things and the good and the positive outcomes that you're trying to put into the world, which is, I think, absolutely important, especially given how much media there is out there. You need to just produce. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Wanted to say one more thing about about Jake, which I think is really interesting and a cue that I feel like a lot of organizations are taking on right now. And it's an extension of this sort of always on or always there mentality that you mentioned, Ben. And I feel like we often think of that strictly in terms of content and what we put out into the world, right? Like we're, saying to ourselves, oh, we've got to, post every day, or, people need to hear from us. And really we're thinking of like social as this one-sided megaphone where we are sort of blasting out, but we're not actively engaged in any sort of conversation. And if you look sort of like underneath the surface of the Jake content strategy, you'll see something that's really interesting. I think that is a little bit unexpected, which is State Farm is also just as interested in community management as they are into the content side of things. And what I mean by that is Jake is not just like putting out videos, he is also popping up in comments. He is giving people advice. He is also this sort of community management tool where he is interacting with people in the comments or on different videos. And that is an extension of their brand building strategy. So it's not just the videos, but it's also carving out the time to invest in that community management side of things. They don't even call their followers, they call them neighbors, kind of play on the, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. And I feel like we would all be served to think about, what is sort of the distinction for our own community, right? Because if we're just thinking of our community in terms of, monetary value, if we're just thinking of them as supporters, that's a pretty kind of like bleak characterization. Whereas there's something so humble and lovely about neighbor, that really, I think, makes you feel like part of something bigger. So another thing I would urge, people to think about, which is like, how do we want to regard, our community outside of just their contributions? And how can you make people feel like they're truly part of this bigger mission? So when those asks do occur, feels almost like a secondary thing, but a secondary thing that goes without saying, of course, we'll support you. And also think about just for how your brand surfaces in different ways, how you're replying to questions, on social. Are you really doing so in like the conventional kind of like customer service way where, it sounds like you're basically like an AI agent, just sort of responding with the hours, of your business, or copy and pasting like an FAQ from your website? Or are you being more human and conversational and really kind of thinking of all of those touch points as like an extension of the personality that you're trying to convey? So even if you're not ready to be Jake from State Farm, and even if you're not ready to sort of take on that mantle and to embody like, a personality that is sort of like as fun loving, as that, what are some like simple ways that you can convey that there's a human, behind the device who is responding, who cares, in a way that is more kind of not just like one dimensional, but really kind of says something about, what the organization believes in. So yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from it for sure.
Daniel, thank you so much for your insights this week. I do want to pause and apologize to the 580,000 insurance salesmen out there that we probably offended in this call.
No hate at all.
No hate at all. Well, that's it for today's episode of Shoestrings. We hope you picked up a few scrappy insights to put work on your own campaigns. If you like what you heard, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really liked us, please leave us a review. It helps other scrappy marketers and challenger brands find us. You can also connect with us on clickon.co/shoestrings for more resources and behind the scenes content. We'll be back next week with another breakdown of big ideas on a shoestring budget. Until then, keep creating more with less. Thanks, guys.